to the Muscle Shoals Florence chapter of the Alabama Archaeological Society. I'm Mark Cole. Today we're going to talk about the quad site, and the quad site is probably one of the most well-known Paleoindian sites in the Southeast. If you can imagine what life was like in the 1950s especially, there were very few professional archaeologists in Alabama, really in the Southeast. And the primary duo were in Knoxville at the University of Tennessee. And of course, we had Dr. David D. Jarnett here in Alabama. But a lot of the research that was done in this area, beginning in the 1950s, was done by amateurs, just collectors who would go out and just out of their interest for early American history would collect arrowheads and record sites. And they were advocated by people like DeJarnette and Knudsen and others from the University of Tennessee to record their sites. And that's really the basis for what we know about a lot of the sites that we know about now, but especially about the quad site. So a little bit about me first. I've been doing this research now for 20 years. My research really has been a lot of documentation of collections, primarily Paleoindian collections. I've recorded sites for the Alabama State Site File, written many journal articles. If you study the Alabama Journal of Archaeology, I have several articles in that publication. And then I also have interest in early Alabama and up to the Civil War. But what we're talking about today, the quad site, is best known for the earliest known cultures in the Southeast, and that's the Clovis people. We'll call them alternatively Paleoindian, fluted point people. They were the people that made lanceolate projectile points, arrowheads out of stone that had a flute in them, just a notch in them. For nobody really knows exactly what it was for. Various schools of thoughts about what it was, but it's the earliest known culture in Alabama. It was followed by a similar technology, Cumberland redstone, that are longer, more slender in profile, and then unfluted varieties about 2,000 years later, Quad Beaver Lake and into Dalton and early side notch. But the Clovis is the earliest culture that we know about. And believe it or not, as much as North Alabama is known for Paleoindians, in the 1950s, there wasn't a known Clovis culture in the Southeast. And even though a Cumberland fluted point was found by David D. Jarnett and his group in excavations of Wheeler Reservoir, it really wasn't recognized as Paleoindian culture. It was kind of considered an isolated find. But that was one of the earliest finds of a fluted point in Alabama. So when this site was discovered, it had a lot of notoriety. This is Dr. Frank Soday. He is a chemist, chemical engineer. He has a master's degree and a PhD from Ohio State University in chemistry. And he was transferred from Arkansas to work at a plant called Chemstrand Chemical in Decatur, Alabama. And Dr. Soday was a very long time collector of arrowheads. He grew up in Pennsylvania. When he was in Pennsylvania, he studied a site there that produced Paleoindian components called the Shoup site, which became very well known. So he was familiar with Clovis technology. He had seen it before, and he was hoping that during his research here in Alabama that he might run across that technology here. I met with Dr. Soday's nephew, Jerry Carr, who lived with Dr. Soday in Decatur in the 1950s. And Soday, I actually wrote a paper about him and published it individually because he's a very interesting character. And I won't get into all of his background, all of his history. But suffice it to say, Soday's discovery of the quad site at this time was a major find, brought a lot of notoriety, made him famous, and a lot of the people that studied the site around him very famous. This is Dr. Carr, who lived with Frank when in Decatur in the 1950s. And the way that he and Dr. Soday would collect together is Dr. Soday had an Evinrude engine. He would go to the Decatur boat harbor or whatever boat harbor he was going to search at. And he would take his engine and rent a boat. And they would go out all day, look for arrowheads. So that was a common theme with Dr. Soday and Dr. Carr. When Soday found the quad site, Dr. Carr told me that they had pulled up to a small island, and Dr. Soday got out and reached down and picked up he saw a green artifact, and he picked it up and he put it in his mouth, pulled it back out, and it was a Clovis point. And he said to Carr, who was obviously a child at this time, I had been looking for this for 20 years. And he realized he had finally found a fluted point and a very important fluted point site in Alabama. But along with Dr. Soday, he came to realize that there were actually several other people that were collecting this site and just beginning to find an early Paleoindian component here. Several of these men now are very well known in history. David Holtz and Jack Cameron are obviously the authors of the point type book that we still use today, Handbook of Alabama Archaeology. Joe Wright was a very young man at this time. This was before he went to Auburn and became a wildlife conservation officer, but grew up in the Decatur area and collected with this group of people and knew them very well. J. Ross Williams and his son also were early collectors, but really these men were the only people who collected the quad site for a period of probably about 15 years. And in 1989, Holtz and Wright wrote a paper about the quad site that was published in Tennessee Archaeologist. And in that, they provided an inventory of 40,000 total artifacts from this complex and almost 200 fluted points. They believe that that is probably 50% of the total artifacts that were collected at the quad site during this period. So what was the quad site? The quad site was an area of the Tennessee River where several streams and spring runs ran into the banks of the river, kind of created a swampy area to the north of the river in that area. But there was across the river from the mouth of Flint Creek, so there was a source of rock, stone in this area. And for about 4 miles of riverbank across from Decatur, Alabama, there are islands now that we see that consist of just crushed rock, flint, chert, pieces of artifacts, pieces of just rock that look very similar to this picture. This picture was taken by Charles Hubbard of one of those rock scatters. And they were just littering this floodplain, this barren floodplain, once the water receded in Wheeler Lake and these islands would come up. They would be littered with these rock scatters, and they would be as big as this room. Walk a few hundred yards and you'd find another one. And some of these scatters were producing fluted points, which was very uncommon at the time. And quad was probably the first Paleoindian site that researchers ever really realized was in Alabama. Again, just some examples of artifacts from Jack Cameron's collection from the Quad site. There's a Dalton's, Beaver Lake, Clovis, Cumberland, fluted points. But again, at this time, nobody had ever discovered a site like this before. Fluted points were very uncommon. And the fact that they were showing up, not only one or two, but several hundred fluted points in a relatively small area, made the Quad site very famous. And at the time, in the 60s, many archaeologists from throughout the United States would reference it in articles. There was a lot of research done on Soday's collection and the Cameron and Holt's collections. From that period, there were several other collectors that started going to these sites and making small collections, and there were even some professional studies. Now, by the time the professionals were able to get very involved in this, the Quad site had pretty much washed away from erosion, but there were some studies. I wish Scott were here. He was one of the people who studied Quad in the early 2000s. But one of the good things about the Quad site and about the men and women that collected this site was, contrary to a lot of collectors, they kept very good notes of what they found. They recorded the site, they recorded the artifacts they found there, the types of raw material used, any other notes, the type of arrowheads. So we have complete inventories of what they found, where they found it. So that was a very important addition to the history of archaeology in Alabama. But the Quad site has become probably the most famous Paleoindian site in Alabama. It's because of their work. Total artifacts I mentioned before were 40,000, but you can see of that 40,000, just a very small sliver, about 200 were fluted points. So even in a very dense site, a site that produced thousands of Native American artifacts, it was still a relatively rare occurrence to find a fluted point. And there are? Yeah, we'll look at that. The Quad site was not necessarily a site itself when you think of a site, like the Indian Mound here, but it was a pair of islands about a mile long with several sites within them. And each of those sites, if you combined the artifacts found there, these are just the Paleoindian points, produced about a 200 fluted points total. But if you looked at any of those one sites individually, only a couple had over 20 fluted points and were really very important. We'll look at that in a second. But Mike, this is an inventory of the later early archaic points. And I have inventories for the other, but this is the group of artifacts that occurred after the Paleoindian period. And you can see still very heavy numbers and over 3,000 side notched points found on the Quad locale.
Mark, I think Quad site's a complex. How big do you think the Quad site complex was?
It's I've got some pictures. We'll look at the maps. It was about 40 acres for the Quad itself. We'll go into that, in fact, just here in this next section here.
That's what we never fathomed before.
Right.
We're looking at individual sites and thinking of it, okay, here's the site. But these paleo sites were actually spread out over 40, 50, 60 acres, just like Evans half acre.
Like Coffee Slough really is the best example.
Yeah, it is.
But yeah, like Hayes said, this wasn't one, although they call it the Quad site or the Quad locale, it wasn't necessarily one site. as you would think of it. It was a series of sites along the riverbank. So this is an inventory. It's kind of helps you put the quad sites in context compared to other well-known fluted point sites in North Alabama. We talk a lot about Heaven's Half Acre. We believe there's 150 fluted points known from Heaven's Half Acre. We believe that's probably just a small percentage of the total known. Likely the most dense fluted point site in Alabama. But if you list by quantity the sites that have produced the most fluted points, really the first site that was in the quad site comes in just outside the top 5. And it's really only 2 of the top 10 sites within quad have produced the most fluted points of any site that we know of in Alabama. So take it individually, these sites weren't necessarily all that important, except perhaps these 2 or 3 that produced a significant number of fluted points by themselves. But taken collectively again, and in this 40-acre area, this was the first time that they had ever found a location where there were several fluted point sites occurring at the same time in such a close proximity, ever in the United States. So kind of comparing quad to other well-known fluted point sites of the time, at the time that it was published in the 1960s, it was it had the most fluted points of any group of sites known. Now, since that time, Conshohocken and Bullbrook have both exceeded quad, and we believe Heaven's Half Acre would exceed any other site known, any other locale known. But at the time, with 200 fluted points, quad site was the most populous fluted point site in North America. Just to give you a little bit of context Mike asked the question about other types of artifacts. There were tens of thousands of tools, right? Side scrapers and end scrapers and uniface thumbnail scrapers and just blades, debitage. All of that was recorded. The type of turret, again, was also recorded. One of the things that made quad kind of interesting is it's known to be within close proximity of a quarry that was used by Native Americans on Flint Creek, about a mile south of the quad site. But most of the artifacts, 80% of the artifacts, were made of Fort Payne chert, which was likely quarried from the Muscle Shoals or in the creek banks or out of the creeks in that area. And there's a lot of questions about why they chose this particular part of the river, because if you go north or south, east or west, you just don't find fluted point sites in this number occurring, right, until you get to Coffee Slough or Heaven's Half Acre. So that it would be conjecture for me to just some thoughts here on why they may have been there, but they're purely conjecture. At the time, this is a map of all the known fluted point sites in northwest Alabama. At the time, quad was pretty much on its own as far as a locale. And again, you can see 24 fluted point sites in this very small area was just unheard of. But as time went on and we learned more, you see Heaven's Half Acre is very similar to that. P1's very similar to that. Coffee Slough also. But again, in the 1950s and early 60s when it was discovered, it was the only known fluted point locality in the southeast, really. And it opened the door for all of these other sites and localities to be recorded, because people became so interested in the fluted point people, and they would go out looking for the quad site or go out looking for another fluted point site, and they would happen upon these other places and they would record them. When Frank Soday wrote the first article about the quad site, and when he wrote a description of it, he described it as being along the banks of Beaver Creek. There was no Beaver Creek at that time, but there was a Beaver Dam Creek very nearby. And I know that several collectors from that time searched Beaver Dam Creek, and that's one reason that there were a lot of fluted point sites found in Beaver Dam Creek, because they were looking for quad and found others. But the location of the quad site became pretty well known, but it was just the difficulty of getting to these islands without a boat that made it difficult for a lot of people to try to collect. So this is a 1814 map of the Tennessee River at Decatur. This is Decatur. This is Flint Creek. And I've superimposed the quad site islands as they look now in low water on top of that landmass. But you can see here the Beaver Creek that Soday was talking about was this creek that's running parallel, or slough, or whatever it was at the time, that was running parallel to the Tennessee River in this area at the time. And this would have been attractive for a number of reasons to Native Americans, obviously for amphibious and fish food sources, but this is a good example of, you know, what the quad site would have looked like during the period that the Native Americans were really there. And then a map of the quad itself and the islands where the sites are showing up. Now, I mentioned if you go east or west that you really don't find other dense fluted point sites. There is another locale here called the Stone Pipe locality that Cameron and Holtz also talked about. It wasn't nearly as dense as the quad site, but when researchers talk about the quad locale, they often are talking about this entire region here, which is about 100 acres. And it's basically from the mouth of Limestone Creek to the mouth of Round Island Creek. In 2003, the water was historically low for what I remember, and I was able to go out on the quad site and actually GPS each of the sites with one of the collectors who had worked at quad for several years, a couple of decades. So we went and mapped each of the rock scatters and got them recorded for the Alabama State Site File. And this is a map of those sites. And again, you can see that at normal pool, you're not going to see this landmass. You can see the power line and the island that the power line is on across from the City of Decatur, from the causeway. But most of these you're not, in fact, now they've eroded so much, you very seldom see any of them intact. But some of my favorite memories were Jen and I walking into the quad site from, you know, either 65 or from 31. And it would take us, you know, 4 or 5 hours just to walk there and back. But I remember going down there, and Jen, I'm sure, remembers this too, times when we would go down there and the islands would be showing up and you could see the stumps in the slough. And I would think to myself, man, if I could just walk to that next island, I'm sure there's a Cumberland fluid point waiting on me there. But I never tried to do that until we boat.
This work is the elevation about 411 to
This one,
14 feet.
No, this is, so normal pool is 555 in this part of the Tennessee River.
So it's 80, 90 feet higher than here.
Yeah. And low pool, when I actually went, it was 551.5, which was the lowest it had been in probably a decade. I don't think it's been that low since. But again, there are times, once or twice a year, where if you're on the causeway and they drop the water really low, you can see this big mass, and I've got some pictures I'll show you, of mud and dirt and land. And that's what the quad site was. But it's a long, muddy expanse. Like when you think about some of you guys that collect Coffee Slough, you can just imagine when you get out on some of these places, there's just nowhere to go, right? You're kind of on your own. It's like being an explorer. So this presentation is really designed so that I can kind of take you for a walk down this levee and back up this levee along and see each of these sites. And not only from the pictures that I took, but I have pictures that other collectors took of the quad site from the 60s and the 80s and the 90s that I'm going to show you photographs of too, so that you can kind of see what it looked like during the time that it was really being collected hard, and how erosion has pretty much resulted in this complex being washed away. So I'm standing in this photograph at the Iron Horse site, which is right in here. It was a very well-known site that was known for a literal toy cast iron horse that David Holtz found on this site at one time. But he also found several fluted points here. I think it's 3. And at one time, the land was much higher, as you'll see in the pictures. But just for reference, and I'll talk about each person's photographs as we go through. David Holtz and Jack Cameron, photographs from the 60s, John Gustafson in the 70s, and Charles Hubbard from the 1980s. This first photograph is of the causeway in Decatur. And of course, this is the boat. We're parked about right here on this, what we call the new site. One of the things that I didn't mention is I have this presentation posted on academia.edu, and you can go and look at it, or you can read the paper that I wrote about the quad site. And I've had several people that were from Decatur that have moved off that have sent me emails or packages saying, I used to collect that area when I was a kid, and I found such and such artifact. They've sent me broken Clovis points and tools and all kinds of stuff, or sent me pictures. So it's really neat to see how many people, we really don't know how many people collected this area, but this is one site in particular that I have a couple of fluid points from that were from George Johnson, who was a diver that used to dive on this site here. It is mud. These are stumps. It's muddy. And man, I mean, you know, you've been out at Coffee Slough. The mud can get over your boot deep, right? And really, walking in this kind of stuff is more, you're really better off trying to sled your feet than to try to walk if you can. But yeah, it's very deep. I measured it at various depths, but up to 36 inches deep. And it's mainly just silted over now, right? Residue from flooding over time. Now that you'll see photographs where the stumps are barely out of the ground, now they're completely out of the ground, and that just gives you an example of the erosion that's occurred on this site. If you were going to see one of the islands during low water, this would be the most likely one, because again, you're only a couple hundred yards from the Highway 31 causeway. So you might see this island. This is a photograph of the Iron Horse site that I was standing on earlier in my very first photograph. And you can tell, right, how much more soil was on this property during the 1970s when John Gustafson took this photograph as opposed to when I was there. This is another photograph that I took of the Iron Horse site. This, again, just a scatter of rocks, a few rocks and stumps across the landscape. You can see that it's basically down to the yellow clay, no really topsoil, so to speak, or anything other than silts left on the. And this was even 21 years ago, right? So this is John Gustafson's wife, Barb. I probably got a picture of Jen somewhere on Quad. But in the 1970s, walking along this levee here, the second levee at Quad site, and you can see how much different it is, how the land is still showing up and the stumps are still pretty much in the ground. Again, just a little farther down the levee. Again, second levee though, and tons of stumps. Obviously, most of these have washed away, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. But, you know, when Wheeler Reservoir was flooded, of course, they came in and cut all these trees, and they left the stumps, and it's underwater most of the time. In a boat, you have to be really careful or you'll scrape bottom. So that's basically an image of the same location 30 years later, and you can see these stumps are sitting, 12 inches out of the ground now. So quite a bit of erosion on this group of sites. This is a neat picture. This is one that Charles Hobart took in the 1980s, and he's standing kind of what is the Quad site proper, which is the 4 islands around the power line. That's what Frank Soday called the Quad site. And he's looking towards the power line tower in the 1980s. You can still see that there's some soil here. You can still see debitage and firecrack rock on the ground here, stumps in the 1980s. This site was actually named because in the 50s there was a persimmon tree that was still on this island, but it had washed away by the time Charles took this photograph. Here's a good picture of firecrack rock and debitage. Now this is a fire that's eroding out of the ground, right? This is a Native American artifact in itself. The remains of the charcoal remains of a fire pit in that same area, looking south towards the river from where Charles was before. 20 years later, and I'm standing in about the same area again, and you can just see just an expanse of silt with a few mussel shells, but basically level, washed flat, and not a lot of opportunity to find artifacts anymore here. This is another neat picture. This is closer again to the power lines that John Gustafson took of that first levee and the stump sticking out of the ground. One great story that John told me about this site in particular is that he and his wife and children used to go collect at the Quad site, and he had pulled the boat up to this south island here, if you look at the map, and his wife had found a Clovis point, a complete Clovis point. And of course that upset him. He wanted to find one himself, and so as they got ready to leave, he thought, well, I'll float over here to this area here and see what I can find. He pushed the boat off right across to the next island north, And when he got to the other side, there was a Cumberland there. So he found a complete Cumberland right across the slough from where his wife found a Clovis on the same day. So that was a pretty neat story. And then this is a photograph that I took closer to the power line of the second levee in 2005. This site's well known for a 6-inch Clovis point that is in the Overstreet book. It's mentioned as being from Limestone County, quad site. It's found by Ross Williams Jr. here, and it's featured in Overstreet's artifact guide. I think there's a couple of hundred. Yeah. I go back a couple of slides, I can tell you. It was called quad, although quad sites were found there and were kind of new. It was actually named quad because at the time that Frank Soday found it, there were 4 islands where he pulled in, and that's why it was called quad. It wasn't called quad for the artifact. Quad hadn't been named yet, right? The quad point was named for the quad site, which was named for the 4 islands. Yep.
Similar to our Snake Island.
Yeah, right. So again, just a bunch of timber and brush and stuff. Here's a neat picture of a lithic scatter. This is an example that has already eroded, but an example of one of these rock scatters where you would find artifacts at quad site. This one is right at the power line. And one of the few areas you can probably still find artifacts at quad, right along the shore. But these during low water would just start, the rocks would just, as the soil would erode, be left by themselves, and you'd find all types of artifacts on the ground there. Picture of the third levee. This is farther east. We're starting to get away from the power lines and back towards the shore in I-65. This is a photograph taken in what's called the corner, which is where the mainland meets the islands of Quartzsite. Now, there's a lot of thought by a lot of researchers that that island extends into the mainland. And if you were going to find a buried fluted point component in Alabama, this would probably be one of the places you'd want to look, is right in this corner where the quad kind of ends and you get back onto the bank of the Tennessee River. But this is a lithic scatter and a scatter of rocks that were there at the time in the 1980s. And you can see it still had plenty of soil on the ground during this period of time Charles was collecting. We're starting back now on the first levee of the quad, and we're on the far western side at a site that is known as Hematite Hut. The quad, again, is made up of, the way Soday described it, those 4 islands, but then these 4 islands, adjacent to them were another group of islands that Jack Cameron collected that were called the Pine Tree Site. Now, again, researchers call this all quad now, but if you were to break it out, it would be quad, pine tree, and stone pipe would be across the causeway from here. It was the number of pine tree points that he found, reason he called it this. But it's most well known in his notes. Cameron writes that he found a small area, round lithic scatter. I forget exactly what he says, but in this round, he called it a hut site. In this round hut site, he found 18 Cumberland. So this was a very dense site, about the size of this room, round rock scatter of rock that he had a lot of good luck on. I've got again, I've got a lot of Cameron's notes. I remember as I was looking through them one time, I mentioned to Jen that Christmas Eve, Christmas Day of 1956, I can just imagine this. I'm sure this is the way it went. Jack Cameron woke up with his family. Kids rushed out of bed. You know, his wife hands him his coffee. He's sitting on the couch as the kids open the presents. They get done opening the presents, and he tells his wife, "I'll see you later," and he goes to Hematite Hut. And his notes talk about him that day going to Hematite Hut, and I think he found 4 Cumberlands on Christmas Day, 1956. So that's the kind of notes that these guys took. But if there were important sites individually, Hematite Hut would be one of those sites for the number of fluted points that have been found there. This is another picture of Wheel Rim, which is close to Hematite Hut. But again, you can see in the 1980s when this photograph was taken, there was still a lot of rock on the ground here. So there were still things being found. And there's the Wheel Rim that this site's named for. And again, just maybe 100 yards from Hematite Hut, just another scatter of rock about the size of this room where they were finding artifacts. And this is the way it looks today, pretty much washed away. There's not a lot left of Wheel Rim or the Hematite Hut site. In fact, I would say that this was probably one of the few times in the last 20 years that it was even visible. I don't know that it'll ever come out of the ground again. It's eroded so much. This is another photograph of where Barb found the Clovis, right in here somewhere. But anyway, a photograph of what the Quartzsite Islands would have looked like in the 1970s. And you can see they're probably, 2 to 3 foot mounds, islands with bushes that are still holding the soil together. And you can see, if you look closely, the rock and shell still on the surface, right? So this is what they were encountering when they were going out looking for artifacts. Another good picture that John Gustafson took of that area. And again, the stumps are still being held pretty much in the ground. This is a photograph of the circle of rocks. And what's notable about this is in the late 50s and early 1960s, Jack Cameron and David Holtz did an excavation at the quartzsite. They did 2 different ones. This was one of them, and they reported it. I don't know if you can see, but there's a mound of dirt right here. So this is a photograph of one of the excavations, squares that they did on quartzsite, that circle of rocks. Now, they picked circle of rocks because 3,000 big sandies were found here in this one site. So it was very dense. But several Clovis, they found 11 Clovis also here. I'm sorry, 528 big sandy at the time. It was over 3,000 in total inventory. 528 big sandy. 3 Cumberland and a redstone were found here. And in this excavation, when Cameron Holtz did this, they found Dalton in its correct level and sitting just above a yellow clay that they thought was the base of time, cultural time during this period. And they walked just not very far from this square, a few meters, and found both a Clovis base and a Cumberland base eroding out of that same yellow clay. So they didn't find it in the hole they dug, but they did find it just a few meters away in the same association. So they knew that it was a very early site, but it had already, even in the 50s when they were excavating this site, already pretty much washed away. I think it was only 18 inches deep at the time. So again, though, you can see the scatter of rocks along here, and these bushes holding the soil in place. Another photograph in the 1980s. This is Huntsville District Attorney John Hubbard. Circle of rocks, and you can kind of get a visual of how small an area you're really talking about right here, you know, maybe 10 meters or something in diameter. The circle of rocks where 3,000 big sandies were found. A couple of dozen fluted points. And then this is what it looked like when I was there in the early 2000s. And it already, again, pretty much eroded and washed away. You can see the stumps sticking out. Now there, of course, in the 1930s when Wheeler was flooded, people didn't pay much attention, didn't really even know about fluted points or Paleoindians or anything like that. But this land was farmed in the 30s and 40s before Wheeler was flooded. And there were houses, and there are a lot of foundation stones that you'll see if you ever go out here that haven't washed away and are still visible. I think I've got a photograph of one in the photographs or on the property as you walk through it. So this is just another photograph of the Circle of Rocks area there. This is a photograph of me. This was 2 years later. You can see it's eroded even from that 2-year period, quickly washing away, if not already. Here's an example of one of those house places and the old limestone rocks that they used for cornerstones during that period. I thought that was pretty neat because you've got, the oldest culture that we know about, right, Clovis, and then right on top of it, you've got a historic culture, the historic culture. And this is one of the few parts of the quad site that potentially you could still find artifacts on. You can see that this is actually dry. So it had been out of the water long enough that it had dried. But one of the few areas where there was any elevation at all in this entire quad locality. Another group of bricks. These bricks are, I'm sure, 200 years old. And foundation stones. This is a picture of what they called the willow tree. That's the willow tree in the 1970s, and it is at the very end of the quad site. So Joe Wright, I mentioned earlier, was a wildlife officer. He didn't have a boat. Cameron Holtz and most of the other collectors did. So like my wife and I, he would have to walk in to quad by foot. Now, he had the benefit of having a key to the gates, right? So he didn't have to walk as far as we did. But he would park his truck on the dike right here and take waders and walk along the levee here in waders. And this is from that time period when he would walk in waders from island to island. This is a photograph of a willow tree taken by Charles Hubbard. And again, it's still got substantial amount of soil, and you're getting back into the mainland of the Tennessee River. This is the mainland part of the quad here where there have been fluted points found. And again, very likely that into this property, quad site probably extends underground There's more sites. Here in this photograph, Charles Herbert took this photograph of where he picked up a Clovis point during the Wheeler survey in 2000. I was hoping Scott was here because I'm sure was with Charles when he found it. But this is the exact site that Charles Herbert found that Clovis point on. All right, well, that's pretty much it. The famous quad site is not there much anymore. If you ever want to visit it, it's kind of a neat walk. I would go when it's cool. That's kind of the best time to go, in my opinion. But there's still a chance you might find some more recent artifacts. But the Paleoindian component of quad's definitely gone, I'd say. So any other questions?